Hi everyone, it's Dr. Christy Law here, bringing you a slide presentation content covering Chapter 6 for Module 4, which is our next week of content. And as you see on the screen, we have a couple of discussions this week, including 2 responses to your folks in discussion 9 only, and then you also submit responses to people for discussion 10 as well. So that is incorrect. So I will just make that change in real time. We are talking this week about human rights and social justice and diversity and social work. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to ask some questions about your simulation paper, which is due June 13th, which is actually during Module 5. And if you recall, this assignment, which its description is available to you on Blackboard, asks you to simulate either poverty, simulate living in poverty, or simulate living with a physical disability. And there are instructions on how you do that, and then there are specific prompts that you need to answer for the reflective paper that will be due June 13th by 11:59 p.m. So hopefully you have already done this activity. If you haven't, please make sure to go ahead and do it. If you choose to simulate poverty, that is a 4-day simulation. And if you choose to simulate a physical disability, that is a 1-day simulation. So keep that in mind as you plan. So this is covering Chapter 6, Human Rights and Social Justice. Learning outcomes for this chapter include an analysis of some pretty important concepts, comparing and contrasting social injustices such as racism, sexism, ageism, and heterosexism and handicapism, summarizing the philosophical, sociological, and psychological bases of social injustice, and then evaluate implications of injustice for social work practice. So human rights is at the foundation of social justice. Human rights as intrinsic rights means that intrinsic rights protect human life, ensure freedom, and secure personal liberty. The text talks about the UN definition, which tells us that human rights are inherent and fundamental and cannot be taken away or taken for granted, but only violated. So the link here on the screen takes you to a 5-minute video of Eleanor Roosevelt's role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What Ms. Roosevelt said was that if we fail to advocate human rights close to home, we fail in our efforts to support human rights throughout the world. So she had a lot to say and played a very key role in the conceptualization of human rights and the United States as well as other nations' role in their protection. So there are 3 categories of human rights. First generation human rights are those that are civil and political. So they restrict the role of government and political status and life of members of society. Things like due process, fair trial, freedom of speech and religion, freedom of assembly, these are all thought of as first generation rights. Second generation rights are more quality of life issues, adequate standard of living to ensure health and well-being, meeting basic needs. These rights are social, cultural, and economic. And then third generation rights are collective rights, so solidarity among nations and cooperation on global issues such as environmental protection, development, humanitarian aid, international security, and peace. So when we compare civil rights and citizens' rights, we see that civil rights protect citizens from societal oppression and subjugation by societal groups, and that citizens' rights promote quality of life through access to resources. So civil rights protect citizens, and citizen rights promote quality of life issues. So civil rights are those that provide protection from discrimination and oppression, fair, just, and equitable dealings between governments and citizens and among citizens themselves. And civil liberties are constitutional guarantees to freedom, which include rights to question and engage in activities leading to social change. So the graph here on the screen represents freedom for individual citizens, which you could also think of as civil rights, and then civil liberties, which is harmony and order in in society. So together, they provide this issue of harmony and order in society plus freedom for individual citizens. So together, they provide civil rights and civil liberties. So the right to social welfare comes from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, clear about rights to education, employment, health, physical and mental well-being, as well as access to societal resources and opportunities. So all of these are under the umbrella of social welfare, and recent shifts in the U.S. changed welfare as a right to welfare as a privilege or an entitlement. So the shift, and we'll talk about this later in the class as well, is from welfare as being something that people have a right to versus welfare as something that should be considered a privilege or that is considered an entitlement. So some theories of social justice that the text describes include libertarianism, which is the centrality of individual liberty or freedom as social concern of social justice. So things like property rights, unregulated capitalistic economy. Libertarianism opposes the welfare system and affirmative action on the premise that it's preferential treatment and prefers some groups over others. So their disagreement with welfare comes from that place. So they're very concerned with individual liberty and freedom. Utilitarianism is really invested in utility. So what does the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And under this system, most people would have their needs met because we're really interested in helping the most amount of, doing things that help the most amount of people we can. So some would have more than they need and others would have very little. And then egalitarianism is that justice is fair. Justice is fairness. So all persons should have equal access to resources and opportunities. It favors a redistribution of resources to benefit disadvantaged citizens. And social justice ensures that all citizens have equality in rights and opportunities. So access to resources is a moral imperative. It's a moral responsibility, a moral demand. So social work focuses on disenfranchised groups, those who are vulnerable and oppressed. We see social policy as a vehicle for ensuring social justice. When we think about the empowerment perspective in particular, and so this is a focus of this textbook and is also something that that we'll talk about in various ways throughout the rest of the class. So from this perspective, all members share same rights to societal resources and benefits. All members have opportunities to contribute when everyone has the same rights to resources. And social justice is an ethical obligation in social work. When we say that, we mean that it's embedded in our code of ethics, which we learned about in chapter 5. It promotes fairness as justice and is a partisan commitment to those who are oppressed. So we side with the oppressed. So in terms of being partisan or choosing a side, sometimes you'll hear people say that they're nonpartisan, which means they don't choose one side or the other. They're neutral. Because of the positionality of social justice within the profession of social work, we are partisan to those who are oppressed. And so racism, for example, is a social injustice. So racism, one definition is the justification for social dominance and subordination of one racial or ethnic group by another. There are multiple levels of impact of racism. There's individual levels of impact, which include prejudicial behaviors and attitudes really between individuals. There's organizational level of impact, which is an adverse application of policy and procedures that justifies social domination or subordination and really puts one race or ethnic group over another. And then there's a structural impact, which are discriminatory practices in social institutions. And so reform, because of racism as a social injustice, was really demanded in several places in U.S. history, but definitely through the civil rights movement in 3 really specific ways. The rejection of the separate but equal doctrine, so the rejection of the idea that we could still have a segregated society that's equal. The advocacy for anti-discrimination laws and school desegregation, and support for equal opportunity for all in other big realms of society, including education and also employment. And so the question on the slide says, is that enough? Is it enough? Is what we've done enough? And so you can think about maybe examples that you can reflect on in our current society that suggests the answer to that question from your, position. Next is this idea of elitism as a social injustice. So elitism is prejudice against lower classes, and when we're talking classes, socioeconomic classes, stratification based on power, wealth, and prestige. So society is stratified or divided in a hierarchical way based on power, wealth, and prestige. So those with more power, more wealth, more prestige at the top get access to more things, for example. And so there are different reform groups who have tried to affect this issue, including the Poor People's Movement, welfare rights organizations. I also have, if you click on this link, a really interesting video about the distinction between, or kind of diving into the way that poor see life. So really trying to take the view, put yourself in the shoes of those who are poor and how they might see issues that maybe those of us who are not poor might see and interpret in a different way. So it provides us with a way to view some of the intersecting themes in this chapter, which include a global or international perspective on this idea of elitism. So I'll encourage you on your own to review this TED Talk by Rajan Mahahini. Next is sexism as a social injustice, and this is the belief that one sex is superior to the other, consequences that actually hurt everyone, not just women. So sexism hurts all people and not just women. These consequences include a justification of inequality between men and women. It encourages a very narrow definition of gender roles, so it really puts boxes around how men and women are supposed to act based on their gender, and that again harms either men or women who find themselves outside of that box. It gives preferential treatment to male traits and behavior, and it really poses limitations for both women and men. The text talks about the issue of double jeopardy with minority women who experience an intersection of being women of color. So Black women, for example, experience this issue of double jeopardy, and makes talking about intersectionality so important. So intersectionality is a term that has been developed by many scholars over the years. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw is one of the first people who coined the term. And what Dr. Crenshaw is talking about is this idea that in any different kind of place, one person could hold multiple identities, and does in fact hold multiple identities. And so that intersectionality is important to consider when trying to understand their perspective in life. This clip comes from a movie called Iron-Jawed Angels that was produced by HBO in the early 2000s and chronicles the suffragettes in the 21st century. And so the clip really kind of highlights the contextual issues going on at the time that the text talks about, this intersectional kind of issue, and again represents these intersections when discussing the isms that social workers care about and fight against. Another ism that the text discusses is heterosexism, which is the prejudice against persons whose sexual orientation differs from heterosexuals. The impact of heterosexism for those who identify as LGBTQIA include homophobia, which is the irrational fear of homosexuals. The idea is that heterosexual orientation is normative, so heterosexism presumes this as fact. So if we think about greeting cards, for example, you don't see a lot of greeting cards when you look at greeting card stands in different stores that reflect non-heterosexual coupling. I can give you an interesting example, and so I encourage you to look at this for yourself in the future, where I was at a store picking out a card to celebrate a same-sex couple's wedding, and there were not many. If you envision it seems like hundreds of card options. There was two, one for, they labeled them lesbian, and the other for gay relationships. And there were cards in both of the slots, but they were both turned backwards and covered up. And so I felt like that was a specific message that is an example of heterosexism, an example of potentially homophobia, which is this irrational fear of homosexuals. And the oppression ranges from social ostracism to overt anti-gay violence. So ranges from, something kind of passive, like the example I just gave, to extraordinary examples of overt violence that individuals experience when their real or perceived sexual orientation differs from heterosexuals. Gay community organizations and the gay rights movement provide channels for social support and social activism. So these two images take you to the websites of some examples of advocacy organizations that I'm familiar with and have done work with. They give a great deal of information about social support, research, advocacy, and activism. So something to check out if you're interested. Another injustice at the hands of these ism terms is ageism. So this is a prejudicial attitude based on age. And the impact of misconceptions is that it encourages discrimination and misunderstanding. So it's often directed at older adults, and it really is a prevailing pessimistic attitude toward elders informed by myths and stereotypes. Some of these misconceptions and stereotypes about aging associate age with death, assume all old people are alike, believe mental deterioration is to be expected with age, and conclude that older people no longer develop and change. So overall, it really suggests that people age all the same and that all older adults are exactly the same, which is definitely not true. So the Gray Panthers is an activist organization that promotes interests and rights of older persons. So you can click on this link for information about this organization. And then this star takes you to an ageism quiz to kind of test your own knowledge of ageism and what it looks like. So I would encourage you to check that out as well. Handicapism and ableism are other social injustices that social workers care about. The text first talks about the difference between handicapism and ableism, where ableism is preferential status to those persons who do not have a disability, and handicapism is prejudice and discrimination directed against people who have intellectual or other disabilities. So ableism is a preferential status for those who are not disabled, and then handicapism is prejudice and discrimination directed against people who have intellectual or other disabilities. So typically, physical and social factors create an environment that in itself is disabling. So when we say something like this, what we mean is that it's not the fault or a defect within a person who has a disability. It's actually the physical and social environment or that create an environment, that's physical or social factors that create an environment that is disabling for this situation. So to break this down further, when we say impairments, we mean physical limitations. When we say disabilities, we mean consequences of impairments that cause restrictions compared to people without impairments. And when we say handicaps, we're talking about social disadvantages related to impairments and disabilities. So what we want to steer away from are objects of pity, or the idea that disability is not a central part of a person's self-concept, self-definition, social comparison, and reference group. That people are many different things. The disability rights movement has included some extraordinary activists, as many of these civil rights movements in their own respect have included, and some slurs that individuals in this community face relate to, can cause social isolation and marginalization. The pieces around objects of pity and the quote about disability not being a central part of a person's self-concept really relate to empowerment social work practice. So making someone the object of your pity does not empower them. It is not empathizing with them. It is sympathizing with them and almost feeling sorry for them. And what you hear from a lot of folks in this community is they don't want that. They want instead the acknowledgement that it's not a central part of their self-concept. And many folks would say, get to know me as a person and know a little bit more about me in that way. So the image on the screen takes you to an infographic about the numbers of individuals with disabilities, which the text talks a little bit about. And then the second image takes you to an advocacy group called ADAPT, where this is their symbol, and then a really interesting movie about ADAPT's activism. So this is the trailer of that movie. So I'd encourage you to check that out as well. So the collective isms, so if we're looking at all of these collectively, they reflect the insidious nature of social injustice. So it's insidious because it is intertwined, interwoven, integrated in so many elements of our society. One is perceived as less productive, therefore disruptive to the social order. If one is perceived as culturally deviant, then they're disruptive of the cultural order. If they're perceived as psychologically apparent, then they're a threat to personal security. So all of these statements encourage fear and isolating individuals who are a part of these various communities rather than encouraging community and connection. So big question here is, what does society lose because of the impact of injustices of these different isms? What do we lose as a society when we encourage fear and isolation of those who are members of these communities? So question to think about there. There are several different theories about social injustice that help us understand where its roots are and why it continues. I am not going to read through all of these, but I am going to click through them as placeholders for you to explore them deeper in your text if you'd like to see kind of social work's interaction with them. They're likely theories that you have read about or learned about in other classes or heard about. So social Darwinism, sociological theories like structural functionalism and conflict perspective, and then psychological theories like attribution theory, defense mechanisms, and self-perpetuation of beliefs, blaming the victim, just world beliefs. So the sociological theories I mentioned, psychological theories, the blaming the victim and just world beliefs as well. So the effects of social injustice come from a couple of different places. Oppression through discrimination, where a dominant group may target minority groups with acts of injustice. Injustice is also dehumanizing. So labeling reduces emotional connections, and it depicts social problems and human suffering as statistics, which obscures humanness. So it takes away individuals' humanness when we impose social injustice onto folks. Other effects of social injustice include victimization, where people devalue themselves and feel powerless when labeled and devalued by others, and this sense of learned helplessness, this belief that one's actions can make no difference. So some opportunities, obstacles, and empowerment. So effects of social justice really depend on how one interprets a situation and their access to resources. So a responsive environment provides resources, unresponsive environments create risks, like social inequalities create barriers to opportunities. Lack of opportunities create environmental obstacles. Environmental obstacles create shortfalls in resources. So we really get into this unresponsive cycle. So what is social work's role in this seemingly helpless situation? We really fight to expand opportunities. So we support participation in social and political structures. We're very interested in people advocating for themselves, and that's what we advocate for. We want to maximize clients' rights. We want to advocate change to expand opportunity structures and advocate social justice and human rights as well. So social work is a human rights and a social justice profession. So based on this chapter and what we've learned so far in the course, what does this mean to you? So this again is a piece of reflection. According to the code, social workers should strive to advocate social justice and human rights by promoting general welfare, facilitating public participation, responding to public emergencies, ensuring access to resources for all, expanding opportunities, especially for those from marginalized or disadvantaged communities, and eliminating exploitation and discrimination. So social work has a huge role to play in combating social injustice. And I hope that you learned a little bit about that role in this presentation. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks, everybody.